Hello from the Hofburg in Vienna. Please allow me to start with some technical announcements before we officially open the meeting of the General Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Question. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and broadcast live on the OSCE PA's social media platforms and website. In the interest of time, I will not repeat all of the technical details. We will be following the same procedure as in our meeting in recent days. To ensure a smooth experience, I ask all the participants to mute their microphones when not speaking. Likewise, please unmute your microphone only when given the floor. We have 20 people signed up on the speakers list for agenda items 3 and 6, following the instructions sent to all delegation on 15 February. The list of those wishing to take the floor in the general debate was formally closed yesterday. However, I know some colleagues may wish to add their name to the list, should time allow. If it's the case, I encourage members to register their interest through the chat function. And if time allows, we will try to add them to the end of the list we already have. In any case, the list of speakers will be completely closed 13 minutes into the meeting. Due this very high interested and our limited time available, all debate participants are requested to limit their intervention to 2 minutes. Colleagues, as you have seen, the agenda of our meeting has been circulated. I understand that many of us wish to address recent developments. I think that this can be done within the frame of our planned agenda. I hope we can agree on this as a basis for our meeting. Thank you. I ask everyone who intervenes to please pay attention to the timer which will be visible on your screens. This will help ensure we can all engage in the discussion. With that, I will move to the agenda item 2. Friends, we have a very busy schedule today, so I will not take very much time. However, I would like to inform you of some of the work that I and colleagues have been doing on your behalf in the past half year. At our last committee meeting a year ago, we had an excellent debate focused particularly on the impact of the COVID pandemic on human rights. We may have all gotten used to the oddities of living and working during a pandemic, but the challenges it presents to human rights and humanitarian needs remain significant. Together with my colleagues, Michael Link and Johan Büser, I have continued to bring attention to human rights problems as they have occurred. On many occasions, our statements and communication have been done jointly. I think this is a strong sign on behalf of the committee, and thank them both for their cooperation. Our work has taken 3 different approaches. We have spoken on thematic issues such as addressing discrimination. Second, we have looked at structural issues such as the impact of the OSCE's consensus rule on human rights engagement. And 3, we have spoken out on specific localized issues such as the migrant situation on the Belarus-Polish border, NGO treatment in Russia, and the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. All of us have maintained an open dialogue with human rights defenders and analysts, as well as with state authorities in various countries. This enables us to engage a constructive dialogue that can hopefully result in positive changes. We have only spoken out publicly when we thought it was particularly urgent and important to do so. In the face of persistent and grievous problem, I think this is our responsibility. All three of us visited Warsaw a few weeks ago. This visit gave us the opportunity to meet and exchange views with experts in ODIHR on priority human rights topics, but very importantly, we also had exchanges with representatives of the Polish OSCE chairmanship on their priorities of the year, for the year. It was also an excellent opportunity to continue our committee's practice of meeting with national parliaments, human rights committees, so we can benefit from their expertise and maintain awareness of their priorities. Needless to say, I think that in the coming days and weeks, I fear that we will need to pay particular attention to human rights and the humanitarian situation in conflict zones. I don't want to take more of our limited time, so we will move to the agenda item 3. Our rapporteur, Johan Büser, newly elected at our meeting in July, will now give us an initial overview of his intentions concerning his report for the upcoming annual session in July. I have already had the opportunity to discuss some matters with Johan, and I very much look forward to seeing the report in the coming months. You have the floor, Johan, and I ask you please to keep your comments within 5 to 7 minutes if possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, and dear parliamentarians, dear colleagues, and dear participants. Today, I'm going to present some of my initial thoughts of the upcoming report on democracy and human rights, which will be presented and delivered at the OSCE summer meeting in Birmingham later this year. Of course, it's impossible not to mention the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And of course, this perspective will be included in the report as it is, because as long as the European security order is not being respected, we must mention this, because it's impossible to upheave democracy and human rights when the European security order is not being respected, and it will affect these fields, obviously. So during the past 2 years, COVID-19 also has led to great uncertainty. Governments were called upon to act and have taken vast and unparalleled decisions to contain the spread of the virus and protect the lives of their citizens. However, the global crisis has also exposed existing human rights violations and inequalities. It has particularly had a devastating effect on vulnerable groups and societies. Many measures have directly or indirectly curtailed our human rights and affected the freedoms of millions of people around the world. And this is, of course, important to mention in the upcoming report. It is our responsibility as parliamentarians not only to work internationally, but to raise issues in our countries and hold our governments accountable. We can support governments in facing major social and political challenges, whilst ensuring that the implemented measures will not undermine values of human rights, democracies, and the rule of law. With this above being said, I plan to focus on 3 groups of challenges in my report and as well in the resolution, and I intend to propose implementable recommendations to the current challenges we are facing in our common region. First, I believe that the shrinking of the space for civil society requires our dedicated attention. Through legislative acts, unilateral decisions, threats, and illegal measures, the infringement on the independence of civil society by some states and other actors affect our democracies. This is a problem for which we should find common solutions in order to ensure the preservation of basic civil and political rights and ensure that civil society can maintain its independent action. Many of us will have noted widespread political discontentment and doubts related to democratic processes, often rooted in socioeconomic disparities. The answer to this cannot be cracked down on independent thinking or basic freedoms. As parliamentarians, we must engage in discussion to find suitable solutions that engage and support the citizens who have elected us in order to give them a choice and a voice. We must also redouble efforts to ensure that outdated patriarchal values do not resurface and once again restrict women's roles in society. I am particularly thinking here of the violence and harassment that women politicians and journalists regularly face. Secondly, we must give real effect to minorities' rights and support their full inclusion into the society. With what I'm having here in mind is LGBTQI people's rights, the rights of religious minorities, ethnic groups, or indigenous people. And the recent years, we have seen countless examples of unacceptable exclusion of these mentioned groups. We have also seen that parliamentarians have a key role to play in supporting the effective implementation of human rights for every group within our society, especially the most vulnerable ones. This is our collective responsibility, and I hope we can all agree to accept this responsibility. The international community's attention has repeatedly been drawn during the past years of examples of systematic destruction of people's traditions, values, language, and other elements that make a group of people distinct from another. We must acknowledge such efforts plainly and honestly, and we must build trusting societies that work for everyone. The third ambition is that we must continue to develop solutions to guarantee freedom of press, expression, and assembly, which have been so challenged in recent years. Legislative and physical violence against journalists cannot and will never be justified. We have to remember that the independence of the media is vital for a well-functioning democracy, meaning that it is our duty to protect it and ensure that journalists will remain free from persecutions. With the pandemic and the shift to digital actions, media and citizens have developed new ways of expressing their opinions, and we have to continue to protect their fundamental freedoms, be it online or in the streets. I also hope that we all can agree in protecting the right to assembly. Dear colleagues, as parliamentarians, it is our duty to find solutions to such issues. Multilateral bodies such as the OSCE represent the space we need to develop solutions through dialogue that can genuinely support our societies. I would therefore welcome any comments on what I've said about the priorities for the upcoming report. I'm looking forward to hear your comments, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Johan, for this brilliant report. We now have time for discussion on the presentation of Mr. Büser. Due our time constraints, I set a speaking time of 2 minutes, and I give the floor to Azay Guliyev, Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will be addressing this distinguished committee as a head of Azerbaijan delegation to the OSCE. Dear colleagues, when the Genocide Convention was passed by the United Nations in 1948, after Holocaust, the world said, never again. But unfortunately, the promise that United Nations made was broken. Never again became again and again. Tomorrow, the people of Azerbaijan around the world will be commemorating the 30th anniversary of Hojar genocide, one of the bloodiest and the heinous crimes committed by Armenia against humanity after 44 years UN Genocide Convention adopted. It was the first genocide in Europe after the end of the Cold War. On the night from the 25th to the 26th of February 1992, 613 Azerbaijani civilians in Hojar were brutally and deliberately killed, including 169 women and children. The responsibility of the Republic of Armenia for the crimes committed in Hojar is confirmed by numerous facts, including investigative records, evidences from international media sources, and reports of prominent human rights organizations. Dear colleagues, this is a day not only of great sorrow for the people of Azerbaijan, but it is also a black page for all mankind. This day will remain so until the organizers and perpetrators of these inhuman crimes are prosecuted and punished. When such crimes and conventions go unpunished, this undermines all existing humanitarian norms and leads perpetrators to believe their impunity. Looking at the world, I am thinking of one simple question. Why doesn't never again apply to Hojar? Where is our moral courage and political will? People of goodwill all over the world have a duty to speak out and to pursue justice for victims of Hojar genocide. Victims of this crime is not merely numbers. They are mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, family, friends, and neighbors. On this day of remembrance, let us recommit ourselves as parliamentarians to do everything at our disposal in a collective manner to keep our promise for never again, by adequately responding to such crimes in a way that to prevent ethnic hostility and intolerance that could lead to similar tragic events in the future. Let us pay tribute to the victims of Hojar. Let us seek justice for Hojar. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. History has over and over again showed that wars, weapons, and arms are the worst threats when it comes to human security. Yet, there are leaders such as Putin who not only uses the threat of wars, but also start them claiming to protect peace, humanitarian values, and let us not forget, claiming to protect women and children. Well, most women and children do not feel protected by weapons and arms. Most women and children want real human security. The security that comes from good education, safe and decently paid jobs, public health care, and freedom of speech. We want the security that comes from knowing that future generations will have a safe environment because we have not overused the resources of the earth. I'm pretty sure that some of you in this meeting thinks that what does that little woman from Sweden know about being a woman in war? Well, my grandmothers from Finland lived through terrible wars, and they told me that the only thing they wished for was for the wars to end and that weapons and arms would be exterminated for good. I have met a lot of women who live in countries subject to conflict and war, including Russia, and they all say the same things as my grandmothers. So I rely on women from the past and women in the present who want real human security. Women who during the First and the Second World Wars marched for a world in peace. Peace activists in the US that marched against the war in Vietnam. Peace activists in Russia who protests against the war today. I rely on women and girls who have been raped and sexually abused in war and demand accountability. So let us please start listening to them. Let us focus on human security and push our governments to budget clean water, good education, safe jobs, public health care, freedom of speech, and sexual and reproductive health and rights instead of budgeting for war. That is how we protect humanity. That is how we build peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sargis Kandanyan, Armenia.
Thank you. It is, of course, takes great imagination to accuse to a nation who survived a genocide to be perpetrator of a genocide. And our Azerbaijani colleagues usually call our statements baseless accusations. Right now, a few minutes ago, we saw what can be a baseless accusation. Now I want to, Madam Chair, dear colleagues, I want to talk about another pressing humanitarian issue. As we follow the tragic events unfolding in Ukraine, I want to clearly state that the war is never a solution, that the war cannot resolve any conflict. Wars may last days or weeks, but the human suffering caused by wars and the humanitarian consequences of armed conflicts last much longer, even forever. It has been 15 months now since the trilateral statement of ceasefire was signed after a 44-day war in Nagorno-Karabakh. It has been 15 months now that mothers, wives, and children of dozens of Armenian servicemen and civilians are still waiting for their loved ones to come back home, but Azerbaijan keeps them hostages. The trilateral statement was clear. The exchange of prisoners of war, hostages, and other detained persons and bodies of the dead was to be carried out. Armenia has fulfilled this commitment, returning all captives right after the war. Moreover, Armenia handed over all landmine maps to prevent further destruction in the region. In contrast, the regime in Azerbaijan has turned Armenian prisoners of war into a bargaining chip and exploits the issue for trade-offs and manipulations. The statements by the president of Azerbaijan qualifying the Armenian prisoners of war as terrorists is a clear manifestation of politicization of purely humanitarian issue. Moreover, Azerbaijan refuses the implementation of the interim measures of the European Court of Human Rights and conceals the real number of the Armenian prisoners of war and civilians still held in Azerbaijan. Another example of grave breaches of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, is the numerous cases of torture and inhuman treatment of prisoners of war and hostages. In its report, Human Rights Watch described the humiliating treatment and torture of Armenian captives by Azerbaijan as a war crime. Dear colleagues, this assembly should pay particular attention to violations of international humanitarian law and the humanitarian consequences of wars and the use of force in the OSCE region. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sargis. I give the floor to Joe Wilson from USA.
Merci, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, the unified American delegation, bipartisan Republicans and Democrats, along with our transatlantic allies that we so value, our European allies, our Indo-European, Indo-Pacific allies, have all been unintentionally unified due to Putin's war, which is so murderous against the people and families of Ukraine, violating the principles of the Helsinki Act. Here we want to emphasize the devastating human cost of Putin's war against the families of Ukraine, which has so isolated Russia and Belarus from modern society. There are reports of systemic persecution of Crimeans, especially Crimean Tatars, who have spoken out against the illegal occupation. We are concerned about reports of forced conscription of citizens of Ukraine from Crimea into the army, where the young Russians are being sent to their death by Putin. Freedom of religion, assembly, speech, and press are constantly threatened by occupying authorities. We thank the OSCE monitors for having been so successful to relay the tragic reality of the conflict every day in the regions that have been observed in Ukraine. I am grateful personally to have visited Russia a number of times. I was so impressed by the talented citizens who today are being betrayed by Putin in his obsession for oil, money, and power. 2 months ago, I visited Kyiv, and it is horrifying to know of the attacks today. Sadly, in Belarus, dictator Lukashenko has become a puppet of Putin to subject the Belarusians to an autocracy, facilitating Putin's illegal war on Ukraine. It is inspiring that the legal president of Belarus, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, would put her first loyal to the people of Belarus, not to the war criminal Putin. Thank you for your attention.
Go on.
Thank you. The floor is to Lord Dubs from UK.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to make 3 brief points. My first one is to congratulate the rapporteur on his excellent presentation, and I look forward to engaging with the content of his report when we get to Birmingham. My second point is about refugees. I notice on the lunchtime news here in London that there are thousands of people fleeing to Poland, to Hungary, and even possibly to Moldova from the Russian occupation, Russian attacks on Ukraine. I think there are two responsibilities for us. One is that we should help the countries at the edge, that's to say Poland, Hungary, and possibly Moldova, so that they have enough support to deal with these people coming in. And secondly, we should, on a Europe-wide basis, agree to take some of these refugees, especially those that have families in our countries. I would give high priority to any Ukrainians who've got family in the UK to be able to come to UK and for that to be facilitated. And my next point is this. I think it's a fundamental human right to be able to demonstrate. And I hope there will be massive outpourings of public support on behalf of the position ECRI is taking against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it is right that people in all countries should show their public support for ECRI's position. Everybody who's demonstrating, and I noticed that 2,000 people have been arrested in Russia, everybody who's demonstrating is demonstrating in support of ECRI's position. And we should reach out a hand to them and say, this is good what you're doing. We welcome that. I think it is important. And I think can I say I speak as somebody who's demonstrated many times, always against the government, whether it's Labour or Conservative, on a whole range of issues, including wars and so on. And I welcome the fact that we have this right to demonstrate. That should be the right of every member state of the ECRI Parliamentary Assembly. And therefore, I welcome the sight of Russians who are demonstrating in support of our policies. And I hope very much that they will not be arrested, but they'll be allowed to go on doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor for 2 minutes only. I ask you to be very, very strict for Tural Ganjaliev, Azerbaijan.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairperson, dear colleagues. I would like to inform you about the situation, post-conflict situation, and also concerning the humanitarian issues developing in the region. First of all, I have to say that the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan is over. With the signing of trilateral statement between other countries, Azerbaijan has liberated its territories, and Armenia agreed to withdraw all its troops from the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan. Concerning the humanitarian issues, first, I would like to say that there are no more any captives, Armenian captives in Azerbaijan, because when war is over, and but because of the end of the conflict, there logically and from the international humanitarian law point of view, there cannot be any person as a prisoners of war, because prisoners of war are existing during the conflict. Because of the conflict is over, and after the conflict is over, some Armenian terrorist groups attempted to attack, to invade some parts of Azerbaijan. They were detained, and then as a gesture of the goodwill, all of them have been returned to Armenia. And also there is another important humanitarian issue, which is the mining issue. As you may know, Azerbaijan is among the top 5 countries in the world whose territories have been contaminated with the mines. Can you imagine? There are more than 1 million mines implanted in the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan. And because of this, Azerbaijani former IDPs, including myself, who are coming from Karabakh region of Azerbaijan, we cannot return back to our properties, to our homes. Because, as I said, 1 million mines pose serious threat to our life, to our daily life, and that's why it's very now difficult for us to return back. And using this opportunity, I ask international community, also OSCE, to help us in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleague. I ask you 2 minutes, please. I give the floor to Ivan Mamaiko, Belarus.
Уважаемые коллеги, прежде всего хотелось бы поблагодарить докладчика Йохана Бюзера за презентацию идей и концепции тематического доклада на предстоящей 29-й ежегодной сессии, которые задают необходимые ориентиры в плане оптимизации наших стремлений в области человеческого измерения безопасности. Уверены, что международные усилия по продвижению и защите прав и свобод человека должны основываться на принципах взаимного уважения. Относительно внутриполитической ситуации у нас в стране, в Беларуси, отмечу, что у нас проводится конституционная реформа, которая буквально через несколько дней, 27 февраля, завершится проведением республиканского референдума. В эту конституционную реформу были вовлечены граждане и организации, готовые к конструктивному диалогу. Конституционные поправки затрагивают ключевые элементы нашей общественно-политической системы. Изменения направлены как на защиту традиционных ценностей белорусского общества, так и на создание возможностей для движения вперед. Предусматривается существенное перераспределение полномочий между ветвями власти в стране и ограничение срока полномочий президента. Статус конституционного органа приобретает Всебелорусское народное собрание, которое станет одним из важных элементов обновленной политической структуры. Подчеркну, что согласно предлагаемым поправкам в Конституцию, Беларусь полностью исключает военную агрессию со своей территории в отношении других стран. Мы проводим конституционную реформу, в том числе с учетом новых рисков и вызовов, с которыми мы столкнулись в последнее время. Итак, 27 февраля состоится республиканский референдум, в ходе которого граждане Беларуси смогут высказать свое мнение о дальнейшем развитии социально-политической системы нашей страны. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. The floor is to Ulviyeva Agayeva, sorry for the pronunciation, from Azerbaijan, and I ask you to be short, please.
Okay, thank you. Dear colleagues, I'm happy to join this meeting today and discuss the important topics with you. I hope you all are doing well. I'd like to touch upon two of the serious problems that we face. It's the mine clearance. As my colleague mentioned, Armenia refuses to release accurate maps of minefields in the liberated territories of Azerbaijan. So far, the mine maps provided are only 25% accurate. And the second crucial issue that I'd like to draw your attention to is Azerbaijani citizens who went missing during the First Karabakh War. Unfortunately, the fate of 3,890 missing people remains unknown since the 1990s. Despite consistent demands from Azerbaijani side, Armenia has not delivered any information about the fate of those missing people since the 90s. The issue never was brought up by the international community, as I believe that these violations should have been adequately evaluated and addressed by the international community. To sum up, I sincerely hope that the policy of these double standards will somehow be stopped, and one day the above-mentioned atrocities will get adequate international attention. Additionally, international prosecution of war criminals might be required for confidence building between societies. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker is Lilith Galstian from Armenia. You unmute your microphone.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you for this chance. Unfortunately, the members of the Azerbaijani delegation never avoid using international platforms to spread lie and falsifying the history. And I would like to drive your attention on some new realities around Armenia. It is in OSCE's interests to speak out against the violations of international law committed against Armenians. Unfortunately, the OSCE member countries prefer to remain silent and were unable to condemn and prevent the aggression unleashed by Azerbaijan and Turkey. For almost 10 months, Azerbaijani troops have been breaking the borders and keeping Armenia's territories occupied. And again, no member country condemned these violations of the territorial integrity of Armenia. Along with human casualties, Armenia also had huge cultural losses. Cases of destruction and scientific forgery of the Armenian historical and cultural heritage in the occupied territories of Karabakh are of a continuous nature. The UN International Court of Justice obliged Azerbaijan to take all necessary measures to prevent the acts of vandalism. But Azerbaijani authorities, violating even the requirement of this decision, recently established a working group aiming to remove the Armenian traces. As a result of the aggression of Azerbaijan, about 90,000 people were displaced from their homes and fled to Armenia. Thousands of women and children are still facing the humanitarian crisis, and despite the provisions of the ceasefire agreement, their safe return to their homes is not implemented. Dear colleagues, the situation in and around Armenia requires urgent involvement. The right of the people of Artsakh to self-determination cannot be considered resolved. The conflict is not over, and it cannot be resolved through aggression. We call on the Minsk Group co-chairs to take immediate steps to restart the negotiation process in accordance with the mandate received from the OSCE. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes debate on this topic. I'm now pleased to introduce Matteo Mecacci, an old friend of the OSCE PA and former chair of this committee, a former member of the parliament in Italy and longtime activist in a number of human rights areas. I'm very pleased to welcome you back to the OSCE PA as the director of OSCE ODIHR. We have long enjoyed close cooperation with your office, and I'm sure that this will only continue to improve under your leadership. Mr. Mecacci, you have the floor, and I ask you to please keep your comments to 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, dear Sereine. Thank you, dear Rapporteur, Johan, Vice Chair, dear Michael. Dear colleagues, it's a real pleasure to be back with you today on the occasion of this winter session. And as it has been mentioned, you know that I have attended a few of these sessions in the past when I was a member of the Parliamentary Assembly, and I was having both the role actually of rapporteur and chair in this committee. I wasn't the vice chair, but actually Michael used to be my chair in Warsaw, so we could maybe in the future exchange again. But it's good to be back with all of you as dear colleagues. I come here naturally in a spirit of close cooperation and aiming at reinforcing our mutual work in making our democracy stronger. As we meet today, and as you have thoroughly already discussed, sadly, the OSCE faces one of its most acute security crises since World War II, with the re-emerging of armed conflict as a tool of choice to resolve political, institutional, or different viewpoints and disagreements among participating states. This is extremely dangerous. We are deeply concerned at the human impact of the military action initiated by the Russian Federation in Ukraine yesterday, especially as regards to civilians. And we are monitoring the situation with deep concern. It is essential that the parties to the conflict uphold international humanitarian law and international human rights law. There is already evidence of civilian deaths and suffering, as well as of thousands of refugees who have been forced to leave. Documented incidents include a ballistic missile strike by the Russian forces outside Vuhledar, near Donetsk, which is reported to have killed at least 2 civilians. In Chuhiv, near Kharkiv, at least 1 civilian was reported killed in a bombing that struck a residential block. Every death is a tragedy, and the belligerents must ensure that civilians are protected. The laws of war that all OSCE participating states have committed to uphold prohibit indiscriminate attacks and attacks against the target civilians and civilian property. In a few weeks, it will be the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the siege of Sarajevo. In 1992, I was a teenager, but I still have vivid memories of the human tragedy that unfolded. This kind of tragedy cannot be allowed to happen again in Europe or anywhere else. This is happening while our society and public life are still largely affected by the ongoing pandemic, as well as by more profound social transformations on the way we interact, get informed, and participate. This continues to be a period of fast revolution and disruption. In many ways, this decade is providing a severe stress test to our democracies, putting pressure on the resilience of our democratic institutions and processes, and for the upholding of human rights and fundamental freedoms. National parliaments have not been immune to these dynamics, witnessing in recent years low levels of public trust, a growing toxic political polarization, and the weakening of the balance of power in favor of stronger executives. At times when state of emergencies have become recurrent features and the traditional balance of power is altered, the ultimate ability of parliaments to meaningfully function and exercise oversight and represent citizens remain crucial. The test we face to safeguard our democracy then necessarily will depend also on the strength of national parliament to resist legislative shortcuts, the abuse of governmental decrees, and other regulations that could undermine the quality of their work. This is why the role of parliaments as the cradle of participation is crucial. They must remain the place where consensus is built and decisions are ultimately made. I'm proud to underline that here the assistance that our office continues to offer to parliaments across the OSCE region in precisely reinforcing their legislation-making processes, both through ad hoc legal opinions on specific legislation, as well as by assessing the whole legislative process. Throughout the last 15 years, ODIHR received and responded to over 400 requests for legal reviews, with a substantial number, over 100, of requests coming from national parliaments. Perhaps the importance of having a strong parliament is nowhere more evident than in the reference to safeguarding and promoting human rights. The work of the PA and you, the third committee, has proved and continue to be an important asset in this regard, raising the attention of selected situations of concerns and opportunities for improvement. We welcome the very ambitious scope of the upcoming report outlined by Rapporteur Büser, and let me stress that ODIHR remain always ready to provide information in the continuation of your work in the upcoming months. As an initial contribution in that direction, allow me to conclude my intervention highlighting here three main areas of concern that we see in the areas of human rights and fundamental freedoms. First, on hate crimes. Hate crimes convey a message of inequality and rejection and remain one of the key challenges for both human rights and security across the OSCE region. Also, they can quickly escalate into wider conflict. At ODIHR, we maintain an in-depth overview of the situation on the ground, which allows us to effectively assist participating states. Second, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. All OSCE participating states have resorted to various levels of restrictions during the last 2 years, due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While public health concerns constitute a legitimate consideration, there is a high risk that these restrictions become entrenched in legal systems and policies. And third, the humanitarian consequences of migration. We see tragic instances of migrant deaths at land and sea borders on a regular basis again. More countries are restricting access to international protection to potential asylum seekers, as they are being illegally pushed across borders or detained in appalled conditions. Your active role as third committee and as member in your national parliaments in advocating for ODIHR assistance remain the most effective synergy that we can jointly promote, including, for instance, by helping galvanize requests for ODIHR legal reviews on human rights legislation being discussed in your country. Finally, in order to be able to fully implement our mandate, including in relation to the conduct of election observation, we need adequate financial resources. With the 2022 OSCE budget, which is currently discussed by our participating states, ODIHR election observation activities are singled out by some of them requesting a freezing of its financial resources. I would ask you to request your governments to make sure that enough resources are devoted to the promotion of democracy and human rights within the OSCE, including through the support of our joint efforts on election observations. I will stop here, extending you once again my gratitude for this opportunity and invitation today, and assuring you about the full readiness of ODIHR to advance our cooperation as an example of excellence within the OSCE. It is in time like this that our commitment to upholding the principle of human rights and democracy are put to a test, and we must not fail. Thank you very much.
Grazie, Matteo. Thank you. I'm pleased to now welcome Ambassador Karlsen to our committee. I look forward to hearing what plans you have for the Permanent Council's Human Dimension Committee. The committee you chair is effectively our committee's counterpart on the governmental side of the OSCE, so it's very important for us to hear your opinion. We would appreciate if you could please keep your remarks to some 5 to 7 minutes. You have the floor, Mrs. Ambassador.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the invitation to address you during your winter meeting. The winter session of the OSCE this year is taking place in a deeply worrying security situation. In such a situation, it is only natural that hardcore security issues tend to get most of our attention. But it is in exactly such times that we should remember our commitments in the human dimension. In the end, the victims of war and instability will always be the people, the inhabitants of the affected regions. We just heard some staggering examples from Director Mecacci as well. Respect for human rights, democratic institutions, the rule of law, freedom of expression, media freedom is extremely important these days, maybe more than ever. Therefore, contacts with parliaments in all OSCE participating states is also important for the work of this organization. Norway will in 2022 continue to chair the Human Dimension Committee, and I am honored to do so. The human dimension is an important part of the OSCE concept of security. At the same time, I would not reveal too much by saying that many of the issues are highly divisive and sensitive even in normal times. This should not keep us from discussing them and keeping them on the agenda. Dear delegates, I would like to start by saying a few words about what I consider to be the role of the committee in relation to the overall work in the human dimension of the OSCE. As a matter of fact, the most important events, such as the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting and the Human Dimension Seminar, are OSCE events where the OSCE chair, now Poland, is in the driving seat. The committee, however, is a format for more informal and thematic discussions, bringing together experts from delegations of the participating states here in Vienna and feeding into the organization as a whole. The committee is, so to speak, the workshop in the OSCE human dimension. The work in the committees should prepare the ground for the Ministerial Council meeting each year. The drafting of possible decisions and declarations take place within the committees. Even if it is not possible to reach agreement on new decisions, the committee should discuss how to implement the decisions we already have, which are plenty. Thus, as chair of the Human Dimension Committee, it has been my ambition to facilitate discussions with an aim to provide for an atmosphere and to find for a good atmosphere and to find common ground. In 2021, we organized 16 meetings as well as a summer retreat. In these meetings, we heard speakers from 25 different participating states and 8 field operations representing all OSCE regions. We had several representatives from the Parliamentary Assembly and its Secretariat as speakers, and we value the good cooperation with you all. We will continue to engage a wide range of stakeholders, including academic institutions, civil society, OSCE institutions and field operations, as well as other international organizations and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. The committee did not reach consensus in the drafting before the Stockholm Ministerial. However, the meetings and drafting sessions gave valuable insights into the positions of participating states and on which questions we should continue to discuss. We actively use these experiences in the planning of our work for 2022. We will continue our thematic approach to the work of the committee. Our work program for 2022 represents both the different views of the participating states and the priorities of the chairperson in office. In January, we had a fruitful introductory discussion in the committee about priorities for 2022. Just this week, we had our second meeting of the year, the first thematic meeting on the issue of freedom of the media, specifically focusing on safety of journalists, in close cooperation with the representative of the freedom of media. Later in the spring, we will discuss such issues as violence against women online, the rights of children and youth, human rights in the digital era, local democracy, best practices for enhancing tolerance and non-discrimination. After the summer recess, and as a preparation for the Human Dimension implementation meeting, we will look at civil society participation in lawmaking processes. We then have an intensive drafting period before the ministerial in Rouge, before a final thematic meeting in December on the issue of freedom of association. Obviously, we may add some topics in the so-called informal meetings throughout the year in light of developments. The human dimension is an integral part of the OSCE comprehensive security concept. Functional democratic societies, respect for human rights and the rule of law are vital for the well-being of all citizens in the OSCE area. We are well aware that this is not always the case, but we seek inspiration in the many interesting debates of the committees on how to improve. I am delighted to chair the Human Dimension Committee this year, and in this way support the Polish chairpersonship. And I look forward also to further cooperation with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly in this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We look forward to continued close cooperation. Colleagues, we now turn to the discussion on journalism as precondition for justice and rule of law. We have limited time, so I will pass the floor to our guest speakers in just a moment, but I want to underline why I wanted this to be on our agenda today. We are all public officials, so I don't think I need to describe why a robust and free press is important to society. On a domestic level, the media is a key partner of parliamentarians in our efforts to ensure that state actions are efficient and that they respond to the needs of the public. Journalists play a key role in protecting the rights and liberties of citizens. For example, by detecting abuse or illegal conduct on part of the government, public agencies, and other bodies. It would be naive to not admit that at times we as politicians are frustrated by media attention that does not suit our needs, but that's politics. Good governance and the rule of law absolutely require a robust and skeptical and independent media, even when it may be irritating for us. Some of us are fortunate enough to live in places where we can take an independent media for granted, but none of us should be complacent. We must all be vigilant and vocal in standing up for strong journalism if we actually want to fulfill our jobs of working for a better society. Colleagues, yesterday's invasion of Ukraine by Russia means that we are now once again facing war in Europe. At such a time, discussion on journalism may not seem the most immediate concern. However, it is sometimes said that truth is the first casualty of war. Our hearts go out to real casualties, at least 130 dead reported as of this morning. But I believe that a focus on journalism remains very important also in this context. We as policymakers rely on accurate reporting also from the front lines to inform our decision. We have already heard many cases of disinformation relating to the situation, including the narrative that Russia's invasion is intended to defend Russian citizens. When lives are at stake, we cannot be casual with the truth and must consider ways to combat such dangerous fake news. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the danger that journalists are facing in the current situation. I fear that we can even expect that journalists providing accurate information about the invasion are likely to be targeted. With that, I will move to introduce our first speaker. I'm pleased to now ask for remarks by Dmitry Muratov. He has been well known to many of us for many years for his tireless efforts to deliver independent and quality journalism at the Novaya Gazeta in Russia. His efforts were recently recognized at the highest level when he was awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. Despite his efforts, Mr. Muratov has unfortunately not been able to join us live today. However, he has recorded a short intervention to inform our debate. I ask to the Secretariat to please play this short video.
Мы сегодня рано все собрались в редакции. У нас горе. Наша страна по приказу президента Путина начала войну с Украиной. И некому остановить войну. Поэтому вместе с горем мы испытываем стыд. В руках главнокомандующий крутит, как брелок от дорогой машины, ядерную кнопку. Что, следующий шаг — ядерный залп? А как иначе истолковать слова Путина об оружии возмездия? Но этот номер «Новой газеты» мы выпустим на 2 языках, потому что мы никогда не признаем Украину врагом, а украинский язык языком врага. И последнее. Только антивоенное движение россиян, по-моему, может спасти жизнь на этой планете.
I now have the pleasure to pass the floor to Teresa Ribeiro, OSCE representative on freedom of the media. Your office has long served as a strong and consistent voice in favor of media freedom. As the OSCE's principal spokesperson on freedom of expression issues, I'm sure you may have particular insight into the topic. I look forward to hearing your input, Mrs. Ribeiro. You have the floor for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear Excellencies, dear members of the General Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions. It's my privilege to be here amongst you today in a very difficult time for our common region, our organization, and our common security. We are not on the brink of war anymore. The Russian Federation has launched a full-scale military operation against Ukraine, against a sovereign state and a participating state of the OSCE. This violates not only our common OSCE commitments and the very principles on which our organization is based upon. It also violates international law and will cause immense suffering. I want to focus my intervention today on the situation of journalists and media and in Ukraine and across our OSCE region in accordance with my mandate. The free flow of information is essential at all times, but it becomes vital at times of crisis. The role of free, independent and impartial media is of utmost importance in order to report on developments on the ground. This is even more true in conflict situations. It's fundamental that we receive impartial and independent coverage of the situation on the ground, verified information in order to have a clear picture of what is going on. This must involve a variety of sources, and it is unacceptable that the Russian media regulator instructed media to use only information and data provided by official Russian sources when reporting on the military operation against Ukraine. Hundreds of journalists and media workers, foreign and national, are at the moment on the ground across Ukraine, reporting on the alarming developments and putting themselves in enormous danger. Their rights and their safety need to be respected and protected for their own sake, for the sake of truth, and for the sake of information as a public good. The first casualty, as you rightly said, Madam Chair, of war is often truth. And we have seen both attempts of deliberate spreading of disinformation and of censorship in the current situation. Freedom of expression and freedom of the media need to be upheld also, or maybe even more in these difficult times. At the same time, Article 20 of the ICCPR states clearly that propaganda for war of aggression shall be prohibited. Propaganda for war and hatred imposed on the media by governments or proxies contributes to the escalation of violence and discredit journalism as a profession that serves the public interest. Propaganda for war is an act of aggression in itself. In the Helsinki Final Act, all participating states committed themselves to refrain from propaganda for war. And I want to underline that this includes propaganda against peace, which the UN General Assembly condemned already in 1950 as measures tending to isolate the peoples from any contact with the outside world. We have to ensure the free flow of independent news and information. We need to stand in solidarity with the journalists and media workers across the region. The safety of journalists and the right to cover developments independently and without fear of retaliation is crucial, including in times of conflict. There can be no peace or security without media freedom. This year, we celebrate the fact that 25 years ago, the participating states created the mandate of the representative on freedom of the media. The participating states understood very well the crucial role of media freedom for peace and stability in the region, something that rings as true today as it did back then. Therefore, our slogan for this year's 25th anniversary is, "There is no security without media freedom." But this is not just a slogan. It reflects our reality today. And I thank Nobel Peace Prize Laureate Dmitry Muratov for reminding us about its implications and intertwining nature. Let me now come back to this session's topic of journalism as a precondition for justice and rule of law, two important bedrocks of democratic societies. But unfortunately, many journalists in our region do not only face the threats of the physical and online violence, but also have to fear a threats of legal harassment, arbitrary arrest and detention, or other abuse of the judicial system. Such intimidations and attacks against the safety of journalists are intended to suppress journalists' essential work, to inform the public, and to hold power to account, which is an essential element of justice and rule of law as well. As described in the recent report of my office in this topic, this risk comes in many forms, ranging from administrative sanctions or criminal prosecution to civil litigation by powerful individuals and organizations, a phenomena that is often called strategic lawsuits against public participation or SLAPs. Such legal harassment can pose a serious stress to the safety and the economic basis of media, and hence has a strong chilling effect on pluralism. The Maltese reporter Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was murdered in October 2017, had over 40 lawsuits filed against her by officials, companies, and individuals. With the adoption of the Ministerial Council decision in 2018, the OSCE participating states reconfirmed their commitment to ensure the safety of journalists, including legal safety. That was over 3 years ago, and since then, the problem has only increased. As part of a new project on the safety of journalists that my office and I will launch in the coming weeks, we will further our work on the issue of legal harassment and abuse of the judicial system. We will build on the recommendations in our special report, providing guidance on how to improve the media's legal safety. Parliamentarians can play a crucial part in ensuring the safety of journalists and protecting the right to freedom of expression for everyone. In this regard, it is essential to adopt a gender-responsive and intersectional approach. Since 2015, my office is working on the safety of female journalists online through the Soft Joe project, based on my Office Soft Joe resource guide and on the report by the PA Gender Rapporteur, Dr. Fry, on violence against women journalists and women politicians. We strengthen the cooperation of our institutions. I hope to work closely with all of you throughout this year. As a first step towards a more effective preventive and protective mechanism for women journalists, we will send out a brief questionnaire to all of you. Based on the results and needs assessment, my office and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly will enable an exchange of good practices to foster initiatives for improved regulatory frameworks and measures for the safety of women journalists. This joint initiative will include several events throughout 2022. We will follow up with more information next week, but you can already now find the survey in the chat. I count very much on your cooperation, and I look forward to today's discussion. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And thank you for describing your project related to the safety of female journalists. I'm sure this is also something we can work closely on in the future. Well, we now come to debate on the topic, and we have about 12 speakers registered. So we will need to be efficient with our remaining time. The floor is done to Diloram Faizieva, Uzbekistan.
Благодарю за предоставленное слово. Уважаемая госпожа председатель, уважаемые коллеги, в последние годы в Узбекистане вопросам обеспечения открытости, транспарентности, а также свободе слова уделяется приоритетное значение. Осуществляется коренная модернизация законодательства в данной сфере, созданы пресс-службы в органах госвласти в целях обеспечения прозрачности и открытости госорганов. Растет количество зарегистрированных СМИ. Исходя из рекомендаций ОБСЕ, отменено уголовное наказание за так называемую клевету. Упрощен механизм аккредитации зарубежных СМИ, разблокированы ранее недоступные сайты иностранных информационных ресурсов. Открыта аккредитация для многих иностранных журналистов. Сегодня новой реальностью страны стали гражданские журналисты, блогеры, которые на системной основе контактируют с органами госвласти. Журналисты начали открыто поднимать ранее незатрагиваемые темы, критика и анализ стали чаще появляться на страницах печати. В настоящее время в Сенате действует специальный комитет по вопросам информационной политики, обеспечения открытости в госорганах. Важную роль в оказании содействия масс-медиа в Узбекистане играет ОБСЕ. И сегодня представители ОБСЕ и других международных организаций продолжают оказывать экспертную поддержку при разработке в стране новых законов в сфере СМИ. В прошлом году в Ташкенте состоялась 23-я Центральноазиатская конференция ОБСЕ на тему повышения общественной ценности СМИ в Центральной Азии. И, как видно, Узбекистан сегодня, исходя из высокой значимости обсуждаемого вопроса для нашей республики, впредь продолжает оказывать необходимое содействие в деле обеспечения свободы СМИ не только в стране, но и во всем регионе. Пользуясь данной возможностью, от имени парламентариев Узбекистана подтверждаем свою приверженность продвижению и развитию дальнейшего сотрудничества, направленного на обеспечение свободы слова как основы прав человека. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I give the floor to Eddie Fry, Canada. Hello, Eddie.
Hello. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think this is such an important debate today, especially given the situation we're in now. One of the cornerstones of democracy is a free, uncensored, and unhindered press. It can inform citizens on matters of public interest, and it is also a platform for exchange of ideas and information. But a free press is also essential to reinforcing other cornerstones of democracy, including human rights and the rule of law, particularly when journalists shed light on corruption and human rights abuses. However, freedom of the press is fragile. We're seeing today that journalists are doing their work at great personal risk. According to UNESCO, roughly 400 journalists were killed for doing their job between 2016 and 2020, and hundreds more were unjustly imprisoned or persecuted every year. I am particularly troubled by the targeted killings of journalists in the OSCE, where we have seen in recent years Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Jim Kuciak in Slovakia, and Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey. I'm also concerned by the persecution of journalists such as Roman Protasevich in Belarus and Sarah Mustafayev at the Crimean Tatar right now. In my 2021 report on gender issues, I highlighted the risk women journalists face. Many of them are refusing to write on certain topics. But the idea that journalism is being disrupted by misinformation and disinformation, we're seeing it happening now, especially on social media, means that we have to be careful as parliamentarians of these dangers and to prevent the spread of disinformation, including bringing about legislation that would look at the safety of journalists and protect freedom of the press for the sake of our democracies now and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. I give the floor to Robert Aderholt from USA.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to be with you today. And I think it's clear, even though we don't always appreciate the central role that journalists play in holding governments accountable. Autocrats silence the press because they fear their undemocratic behavior will be exposed. They want to hide their corruption, abuses of power, and human rights violation. According to statistics from Reporters Without Borders, 11 journalists and media workers have been killed since the start of 2022, and as many as 366 journalists are currently imprisoned globally, many of whom are in the OSCE region. These grim statistics demonstrate that many leaders and groups fear what journalists will expose. We strongly condemn Alexander Lukashenko's campaign of repression against the people of Belarus, from journalists and human rights defenders to peaceful protesters. Likewise, the Russian Federation's ongoing attacks of intimidation against independent journalists and outlets in Russia, such as Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, are out of line with its commitment to participating states of the OSCE. It is an honor today to hear from Mr. Muratov today as he has spoken, and even in the face of extraordinary risk, he has persisted with his tenacity and service to truth. Journalists like him hold the line against corruption and abuse of power. The role of the representative freedom of the media is indispensable in monitoring violations in the free media and expression. The Helsinki Commission held a hearing with Teresa Ribeiro in October, and we support her role in strengthening free media and expression in the OSCE. Likewise, it is critical that we as parliamentarians do what we can to hold one another accountable and support journalists, even we know they're simply doing their job. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. Vilija Aleknaite Abramikiene, Lithuania. Sorry for the pronunciation.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you. First of all, I want to express my appreciation in address of Mr. Dmitry Muratov. Russia needs so much people like Mr. Muratov, and I hope that he is not alone with his firm stance. And at the same time, I want to thank to the Madam OSCE representative on freedom of the media for your firm stance, for your underlining that truth is essential. I think truth is essential for survival of the world order based on rules for our world, perhaps. You know, my question, I wanted to pose the question to you. One of Russian generals has expressed that the main measure of their action, about 80% is not directly military, but some other means. And among these means, propaganda, lie, and some disinformation takes a very important role, plays a very important role. And on the eve of the Russia's war against Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine appeared a large group of people. They introduced themselves as media, as journalists, but in fact, according to security analysts, their task was, you know, diversions, ideological sabotage. And it is not a surprising thing that from this country, we get a lot of disinformation, so-called factories of trolls are active and so on. What tools do you have as defender of truth, defender of real free media to escape this, you know, problem? How can ordinary people to divide between the lie and the truth? What is especially important during the periods like we are living now? Thank you, Madam. If you will answer my question, I'll be very thankful to you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Maka Bochorizvili from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, as we speak now, principles and norms of international law are being violated and trampled on in the middle of Europe, the principles on which European security is based. I can't start my intervention without reiterating our strong support and solidarity with our friends, the Ukrainian people. Unfortunately, in 2008, when Georgia's territorial integrity was blatantly violated, the international community failed to give adequate a response that would prevent the same actions in Europe. Today, we must speak with one voice to make it clear that there is no place for military invasions in Europe, and the states should not be punished for having their sovereign right to choose their own present or future. Dear colleagues, let me reiterate that Georgia is fully committed to the principles of freedom, democracy, and respect for human rights. Our close partnership with international organizations, including the OSCE, guarantees our success to achieve further progress in democratization and protection of media independence. We have made constitutional changes that ensure the media independence and pluralism and realization of the freedom of speech. The media environment in Georgia is pluralistic and free, and this is evidenced by both basic statistics and assessments of reputable international institutions. Our positions in World Press Freedom Index by Reports Without Borders in 60s, which is significant advancement in last decade comparing when Georgia was ranked 104th. This summer, on July 5th, we faced unprecedented actions by radical groups attacking journalists during the rally. To protect journalists, law enforcement officers had responded quickly. Investigations started immediately and 28 persons were arrested on charge of violence against journalists. In closing, let me underline the importance of free and independent media in democratic development of any country, and same time highlight the responsibility of journalists, which is huge in providing truth, which is also important in our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maka. The floor is to Yevgenia Kravchuk from Ukraine.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm sorry I cannot turn my video on because of the poor internet connection, because I'm right now in Ukraine. As you probably know, there is war in Ukraine and we get bombing in almost all of the regions. So I apologize, but let me speak like this. I am a journalist by my previous profession, and I studied journalism in the university. So this topic is very close to me. First of all, I would like to thank you, Dmitry Muratov from Novaya Gazeta, because he shows that there are still media and journalists in Russia. And I want to thank Novaya Gazeta for having a very fair-faced page of their newspaper after Russia started a war. I understand that it was very brave from their point. I would like to point out another side about journalism, and I already heard that some of the speakers mentioned about disinformation. Well, disinformation and media that are controlled by autocratic government can be an instrument in the war as well. The best example is what is going on federal channels in Russia and also in some anonymous Telegram channels, because what they put into this media is it's not even disinformation, it's complete lies. And these complete lies are going to Russian people to somehow justify the war that Putin started in Ukraine. What I mean that right now on Russian channels, they would put the news not saying anything about casualties of Russian Federation in Ukraine. They lost a lot of soldiers. But to the Russian people, they say that no casualties are there. And they lie to these Russian mothers who send their sons to death, because Ukraine is fighting on its own territory and is fighting back. So I think that OSCE should think about, and national parliaments should think about how to close this Russian disinformation in your countries. And we really urge all Ukrainian parliamentarians and delegations, urge you to sanction Russian channels, Russia Today, and also federal channels, because they are not journalists, they are propagandists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The floor is to Helga Vala Elgotir from Iceland.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, free press is the ground support for liberty and democracy in the world. Terrible news appeared to all of us yesterday when the worst case scenario came true. Russia has attacked Ukraine, a member country of the OSCE. The Icelandic government and all parties of the Parliament of Iceland condemns the extensive attacks by the Russian government on Ukraine. This is a threat to European security. It is in a time like this, we have to stand strong with free, independent media worldwide, not only in the countries we think of as a weaker democratic countries, but in every single country. In the name of humanity, we have to prevent war and stop the violence in Ukraine against the Ukrainian nation that suffer the most. But we also have to stand strong with free and independent media worldwide. Iceland is a free country, but unfortunately, also here, media are under attack of big business corporations. Icelandic media needs our support as well as the media in other countries. Innocent citizens have been killed and harmed. Innocent citizens have therefore started fleeing the country of Ukraine and are now crossing the border. We need to take action to support the nation of Ukraine by providing humanitarian support and shelter, as well as free media of Ukraine and the world. Thank you.
Thank you. The floor is to Ahmet Arslan from Turkey.
Distinguished colleagues, globally rising security threats and increasing digitalization, a complicated structure of social media and functioning of social media are bringing about some challenges and requirements for us to protect the freedom of expression and media. Today, a lot of democratic countries are facing similar problems. In this respect, we need to strike a balance between striking public order and safety, and also giving freedom of expression and media. This is quite sensitive. You know, freedom of expression and media is an important pillar of the human rights policies around the globe. On the other hand, journalism cannot be used as a shield to cover up the certain criminal actions and violations of rule of law. Using any profession for the commission of crime is against the principles of journalism. On the other hand, distinguished parliamentarians, fake news and disinformation is a problem impacting all our societies and the media sectors as well. And fake news and disinformation generally are targeting to instigate hatred and animosity in our societies. They are assaulting our democracies through fake news and disinformation. In this respect, we can see a concerning rising trend when it comes to racist, discriminatory and xenophobic discourse. As Mr. Mecacci, Director of ODIHR, mentioned, there is this rising hate crimes, unfortunately. We believe that xenophobia is a threat for the restoration of social safety and democracy, as well as a threat being for integration. We believe that media and responsible journalism has a role for promoting people to coexist in peace. And this is why rather than adopting old-fashioned, inclusive and unsuccessful media and journalism discourse, we need to have a journalism discourse which will be inclusive of the migrants. Migrant participation should be considered. The sensitivities, vulnerabilities and needs of the migrants should be considered. This will be important for the social justice in general. Thank you indeed for the kind attention.
Thank you. The floor is to Kyriakos Avgiani from Cyprus.
I would like to congratulate the Presidium to include this very interesting theme in the agenda, but also Mr. Büser for the ideas and structure of the draft report. Independent, impartial, professional and responsible journalism and a pluralistic media environment are key pillars of democracy as they are holding power to account and facilitate transparency and accountability. The murders of Daphne Galizia and Jan Kuciak shed light on the numerous threats journalists are exposed to, such as violence, censorship, intimidation, and destructive lawsuits for merely doing their work and exercising their right to freedom of expression. In this context, we must acknowledge that legislation is set at OSCE states that still demand special protection of political figures, and such figures should be particularly open to public scrutiny, and the limits of acceptable criticism for them should be wider. In other words, publications which contribute to debates on matters of public interest should enjoy a higher threshold of protection. A rather new obstacle to journalism fulfilling its function as a precondition for rule of law in the OSCE region is the increasing filing of strategy lawsuits against public participation. As you may know, these are lawsuits or other legal actions directed at one or more journalists or media with the purpose of preventing investigation and reporting on breaches of laws. Such legal actions have a direct and detrimental impact on democratic participation. Journalists need to be provided with safe working conditions, guaranteeing their independence. As members of the Parliament Assembly, we have to keep the protection high on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyriakos. I give the floor to Sargis Kandanyan from Armenia.
Thank you. Madam Chair, as you mentioned, as a parliamentarians, it is impossible for us to undermine the role of free media as a precondition for justice and rule of law. As a part of the democratic reform started in Armenia in 2018 after the Velvet Revolution, ensuring the freedom of media and journalism is one of the key priorities in Armenia's reform agenda. Of course, COVID-19 pandemic, as elsewhere in the world, as well as the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, has challenged the freedom of speech and the role and work of media and journalists in Armenia too. But I should admit that we could overcome difficulties and now are back on track of our reform agenda. We are aimed at developing tools to combat disinformation and hate speech. In this respect, it is important to underline that the new public education reform and the strategy in Armenia is designed to pay more attention to media literacy as a long-term priority. We realize that we need to take further steps to improve the training and status of journalists, make systems of self-regulation effective, and combat polarization of the media by increasing transparency in the area of media ownership. In this regard, we pay a lot of attention on media transparency and financial accountability, introducing a new legislation framework. Of course, when it comes to media reforms, it is essential to make the process very comprehensive and inclusive. And here I must say that the Parliament and the government are closely cooperating with the Council of Europe, OSCE, civil society, and of course, media organizations and individual journalists. It is important not to impose regulations, but to create an environment and effective mechanism for media to develop and become more trusted and competitive. Thank you.
Well, dear colleagues, I've just been informed that the next speaker, Mr. Alaichuk from Ukraine, has now lost internet access. I hope that it's not very bad news, and he will come back with us in a few minutes. I give the floor to Mrs. Farah Karimi to the Netherlands.
Madam Chair, dear colleagues, the bravery of Mr. Muratov is really very inspiring. Right now, we witness a growing indifference with regards to our fundamental ideals and principles, such as the rule of law, human rights, and democracy in multiple countries at the same time. Not only in young democracies, but also in countries where democracy has been the form of government for centuries, we see regression. In Hungary, the rule of law has been dismantled. How are free and just elections possible in a country where some parties are disadvantaged and others are favored by the system? Furthermore, the independence and freedom of the press has been frustrated and almost nullified. How are free and just elections possible in a country without free press? Next to dire human rights violations in Belarus, I want also to highlight the situation in Kazakhstan. I met with some victims and witnesses of violent actions by security forces during peaceful protests in Kazakhstan last January. I strongly support the call of our Special Representative on Central Asia for a full and independent investigation on events in January in Kazakhstan. On the freedom and independence of the media, the tireless work of Ms. Ribeiro in reporting on the situation of media show us that journalists are increasingly facing threats and intimidation. Online and offline aggression, particularly against female journalists, is becoming more and more common and concerning, as we heard this afternoon. We as parliamentarians must hold our governments to account regarding these issues. My final point relates to youth. Can I please ask our distinguished speakers to reflect on integration of youth perspective in their work? How are they doing it and how they want to strengthen it? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I met a few days ago Kazakhstan citizen and NGOs, and I share your point of view. Well, I give the floor to Amina Agazadeh from Azerbaijan. No, she's not connected. Then I give the floor for the last speak to Michael Link. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Chair Sereine. Dear colleagues, let me, as we come step by step to a close of this meeting, but of course that is not the final word. The final word is not up to me, but as the Vice Chair of our committee, I at least wanted to really express a concern which in the last year, also during the pandemic, has been coming up increasingly. And as you know, in my working area, an area of special interest and a special attention is always given to electoral observation. The instrument of electoral observation, I think we need a new push together, those of us here in the committee especially, to defend this instrument and to fund this instrument, to defend and to fund. During the pandemic, observations have become much more difficult. We know that. Therefore, it is even more praiseful and important that, for example, in the case of the United States, Kari Henriksen and I could lead a very substantial delegation of the Parliamentary Assembly to the observation of these elections. We have been a lot of us, and these elections, as you all know, have been extremely important. And I praise also the leadership of the Helsinki Commission. They have been fantastic hosts, that the US was leading by example and saying, yes, observation also in such a difficult time is important. Setting no limitations on observations is another important thing. And therefore, it is so important that we have the necessary funds to do it. So please, what you can do in your parliaments in order to convince your ministries to second enough long-term observers, short-term observers, and your colleagues to come and observe would be great. And with Serbia and Hungary coming up in elections, very important ones, I'm very glad to see that many of you already applied. But from the practical side, I know that it's really difficult to find enough seconded observers for long-term and short-term observation. So I think this is a very, very important activity which we need to defend. And maybe we can think together as committee, as parliamentarians, how we can even further improve the follow-up process. Because observation is good, following up is better. Because we observe something, we state something, or they makes a final report, a very important one. We should check how the different countries react to these recommendations. Do they put it to the files? Do they ignore it? Or do they face it and maybe even follow the recommendations? So that is something where we would be as committee very interested in your input, in your ideas. I see a lot of faces who have been, by the way, also in these difficult times, also participating in elections. And last word, something where I don't have an answer, but it's an increasing phenomenon. We have more and more cases of so-called fake observers. What I mean with this, we have countries, I will not name any I will not mention any individual name, but you are all aware of it. We have participating states who try to organize some sort of observation on their own with individual invitations, not along the line of our international legitimized observation. There are only, let me remind, there are only 2 international organizations really mandated to do this. OSCE, Parliamentary Assembly, OSCE, and Council of Europe for the Council of Europe area. All the others have much more limited mandates. But individual parliaments are doing that, and they are inviting, and here we should be careful, because what they are doing is some sort of private or fake observation, observation on special command or whatever, and they use it to manipulate, of course, the result or at least the public image of these elections. And this is, they don't deserve the etiquette and the official name of international observation. So that is something where we really need to think about. Maybe we need some sort of more decisions. We have a good code of conduct for us, for the assembly, but we don't have a tool to deal with the fact that there are a lot of so-called observers who are in reality not entitled to observation. Thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing hopefully as much of you as possible in Birmingham. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for your words. You see that at the third committee, we have to face many challenges, but we have a very dynamic team. Well, Mrs. Ribeiro, would you like to respond to any of what you have heard?
Yes, please, if you allow me, Madam Chair. First of all, let me thank you, all of you, for your remarks. Let me also tell you that I'm really encouraged by your commitment to media freedom and to freedom of expression. This is really important, and the parliaments can and should play a very important role in upholding media freedom and freedom of expression. And I'm sure that I can count on your support in my work, and much more than my work, in this very important mission, which is, of course, to strongly defend media freedom and freedom of expression. Madame Avraka, I'm very sorry. Abrakani Kien. I'm very sorry. So very sorry.
This is
for
not a problem.
Being able to pronounce correctly your
Everybody calls me Vilia, first name. So.
Okay. Next time I will try to be more with a better pronunciation. Many of you, and you are the first one, to raise the issue of disinformation and what it can represent nowadays. We have to be very careful, to tell you the truth, because we need one of the most important international commitments is really free flow of information. And this is very important. It what allows mutual understanding between nations, and that allows also that nations do not close in themselves. So free flow of information is very important. We know, and we are very aware that unfortunately, sometimes this free flow of information, freedom of expression, media freedom are in a way weaponized and used in a different way and used to cause harm. And this, of course, it's usually carried out by actors of bad faith. But the best way to combat disinformation, I keep telling it, the best way is to have resilient societies. This is the most efficient way, definitely. Societies that trust their institutions, societies that really can navigate in the turbulent waters of social media, of this flow of information that circulates in the platforms. And this is the best way. And of course, together with this, and the most important is to have a very vibrant media landscape with good investigative journalism, with very high standards, high professional standards of the journalists. This, I would say, are the most effective tools to counteract disinformation. But we also know, and let's not to be naive, that it's a long-term investment, and we need really to invest in this long-term strategy of media literacy, as our colleague from Armenia just mentioned, that media literacy is very important too. But I would say that this, first of all, it's a multi-stakeholder approach. It's a multi-layered approach, because it cannot only work at national level. As we know nowadays, the media have a global reach because of the digital landscape in which we are living. So we need to have all this kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-layered, national, but global too, and at the same time mobilize all the tools that can really ensure that our citizens are enough resilient to resist disinformation. Of course, in times of conflict, this is another issue. In times of conflict, disinformation is really a war tool, and it's forbidden by international law. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. Ribeiro. Thank you, colleagues, for an interesting debate. This has been a big topic we have tried to address today, but one that I feel strongly must remain high on our agenda. The dangers associated with failures in these fields are simply too great to not take this seriously. Before going to the agenda item 7, I want to thank translators because the sound was not very optimal and they have done the best in order to follow. Thank you very much. Well, do you have additional business? No. Well, I look forward to seeing all of you in Birmingham in July. Thank you very much and good afternoon. End of the afternoon.